It's really a pleasure to be here. Any friend of the BC Archives is a friend of mine, so we're among friends here. As you may have noticed from the introduction, I've spent a long time researching cowboy history of British Columbia. And I thought I'd start out with a cowboy story for you. You know, it kind of encapsulates the situation I find myself in today, sitting in front of all these wonderful people and kind of wondering how I got here. It's about a British Columbia cowboy who was traveling far away from his native ranges in England, found himself in a train compartment across from two fairly stuffy looking old gentlemen. And after a time, one of the gentlemen said, well, since we be traveling together, I think it's appropriate that we introduce ourselves. My name is Anthony Corley Jones. I'm a brigadier, married, one son, one daughter. The gentleman next to him said, well, isn't that interesting? My name is Peter Smythe Worthington. I too am a brigadier, married with two sons. And they both looked down their noses at the dusty cowboy across the compartment from them, but he didn't miss a beat. Billy Barnes, cowboy, not married, two sons, both brigadiers. As you can see, some cowboys are not entirely slow on the uptake. I have to say that ever since I was quite young and learned how to read, I've always been wanting to look things up. And I'll never forget, in grade 3, I got fascinated with baseball because we played softball at recess time. And I read every book I could get my hands on in the library. And that was just kind of how it worked for me. I've always wanted to gain knowledge in certain areas. I'll never forget that my mom had an arrangement with the grocery. Once every month, she would get a new volume of an encyclopedia. And once that volume arrived, and it was a 20-volume set, I would immediately go to it and look for the Baseball Hall of Famers. So I guess you could say that I've been a researcher right from the very beginning. But my career as one started in 1973. I had graduated in English from the University of Alberta and traveled extensively in Europe, North Africa, and then I'd gone overland to India. And when I got back, I was looking for a job. And I went to Manpower. Isn't it interesting? We don't call things Manpower anymore, but it was the place where people could get hired. And they said, well, there's a job available at Fort Edmonton Park doing research. And I thought, well, that sounds pretty good. The good news was it paid minimum wage, $2.50 an hour. And it was interesting because the person I had been searching with was my good friend, Harry Wright, and he had a degree in history. And he felt that this position was way too low in pay for him. So he never did take it, but I did. And so in January of 1973, I began research on what was to be called the 1885 Street at Fort Edmonton Park. Now, how it started out is we went to the archives, we went to the Cameron Library at the University of Alberta and read microfilm of the Edmonton Bulletin newspaper. And I've got a little thing to share here. I certainly hope I do. Volume 1, number 1 of the Edmonton Bulletin newspaper. This is where my career started. And so we spent the next few months reading every edition of the Edmonton Bulletin. And of course, there were 52 weeks in a year and it was a weekly. And so we read every edition right up until the middle of the 90s. And, you know, it was fascinating. What would happen is at the end of the day, we would come out of the darkened library where we were reading microfilm. And we would blink our eyes as we entered back into the 20th century because we had been immersed in the little dusty town of Edmonton in the 1880s all day long. And I was enthralled. I knew everybody who lived there and I knew what was going on with them. And it was just a fascinating opportunity to kind of immerse myself in Edmonton in the 1880s. And so we spent months doing that. And then we laid out what we thought would be an appropriate Edmonton of 1885 streetscape using some of the historic buildings that were collected and other ones that were reconstructed. And I left Edmonton and years later came back and thought, oh, I'm going to visit Fort Edmonton Park. And my goodness, there was the 1885 street, exactly how it appeared in our heads when we put it down on paper. So it was really quite gratifying. But I became the head researcher at Fort Edmonton Park, and we began to research the buildings and the times. And I ended up, I guess I was upwardly mobile because I ended up as the senior historical interpreter for the city of Edmonton. That was the good news. The bad news is I moved from Fort Edmonton Park, which was down in the river valley, to the 10th floor of CN Tower in downtown Edmonton. And somehow or another, this did not seem like the place you could do research from. And so, as many a young man has done, I decided this wasn't for me, even though I was upwardly mobile and might have had a career in the city of Edmonton. I quit and I moved into the foothills west of Calgary, where I spent the next few years hiking and doing contract work for Alberta Parks. And I did a history of the Cochrane Ranch site for Alberta Historic Sites. And so I continued to do my research because it was just kind of what made things tick for me. And after 3 years, I had met a lovely woman, my wife-to-be, Sandra, and proposed. And when I proposed, she had said, well, you're going to get a real job, aren't you? And so I thought, well, okay, so much for living in the woods and doing contract work. And so I showed her, I got a job working at Barkerville Historic Park up in the wilds of the Cariboo. But that was no big deal for Sandra. She had come from northern Manitoba, so she knew all about the isolation that occurs up in the wilds. And so at Barkerville at the day was operated by the BC Parks branch. Now they had run it since 1958 when Barkerville was designated as an important site for the province of British Columbia. But the trouble with the Parks branch is they didn't know an awful lot about running heritage sites. And, you know, they did excellent display work, and they even got John Andre, the well-known display person from the Provincial Museum, to come and design displays for them. But the fact is, they were a little at a loss to what to do with the incredible collection of artifacts that were there at Barkerville. So in 1979, they established a curatorial branch, and that involved a curator, a collections and conservation person, a registration person, and I took the position of the interpretation and education coordinator. And we were a fine group. We got together really well, and we began to dig into the history of Barkerville. And I can say at the time, this was 1979, that there wasn't a lot of published information that we had to draw from. Probably the textbook that we had was a little book called Wagon Road North. And it had been published in 1960 by a man by the name of Art Downs. And it was largely a photograph book, but his research had been very meticulous. And the stories that were told in there helped interpretation and education coordinator like me to put together interpretive programming that really helped to tell the history. And that was the textbook of the day. Now, the interesting thing we found after I was at Barkerville for a while was that the story of Billy Barker was quite an interesting one. It had been written in 1937 by Louis Laborde, who was a Cariboo MLA and who had collected historical information. And Laborde's story of Billy Barker was quite interesting. He said that Billy Barker was from Cornwall. He was Cornish. He'd worked as a pottery worker as a young man. He had jumped ship in Victoria and traveled on foot to Williams Creek. But of course, all the good ground had been staked. And so Billy went below the canyon. And everyone laughed at him because everyone knew there was no gold down there. Needless to say, he struck it rich and became very famous. And a town was named after him. And he married a woman by the name of Elizabeth Collier, who had come over on one of the bride ships that had arrived in British Columbia in the early 1860s. And as Louis Laborde tells the story, And I'm quoting here, "It was not long before Billy Barker's money was gone, and with it, the woman." So we thought, well, that's kind of a sad story, but you know, it was great for doing guided tours. You could say, well, Billy Barker married a gold digger of a different sort. You know, there were great things that you could say, but we began to doubt that the story was actually true. All of Louis Laborda's research was kind of based on interviews he'd conducted with old timers. And I mean, by the 1930s, there weren't too many of them around. So we came across this letter that had come out of the Provincial Archives, written by a woman by the name of Emma Eliza Driver. And she said, "Billy Barker was my dad, and just wondering whether he is still alive and whether any of his money is left." This was in 1872, and it was written to Henry Maynard Ball, who was the gold commissioner for the Cariboo. We don't know whether it was ever answered. What we did find when I was at Barkerville is about once a month, we'd got a letter from someone who said, "I'm sure I'm descended from Billy Barker." And of course, Billy Barker left no descendants, so that was quite interesting. So that's where it sat. But by the fall of 1973, and I'm going to be mixing up my centuries there, by the fall of 1979, I had married, and my wife and I decided we would go to Victoria, where I could go to the Provincial Archives, which I understood maybe would answer some of the questions we had about Billy Barker. And I'm blessed to say that I have been in the Provincial Archives probably every year, not maybe quite every year since then. And I have two lovely friends, Roy and Philomena Hansen, who have offered a room for me to stay in, or myself, my wife, or children as they began to arrive. And so I've always had a place to stay in Victoria. But I began digging, and I found something in Bishop Hill's diary. Bishop Hills had been the Anglican bishop for the mainland of British Columbia. And he had traveled up the Fraser River in the 1860s, and he'd kept a diary. And so I began to pour through this diary, thinking that I could get information on the gold rush, and perhaps because we knew he did eventually get to Barkerville. And I'll never forget the day sitting in the archives when I came across this entry. Saturday, July 7th, 1860, Canada Flat, which was near Cayush, which we now call Lillooet, where amongst others is a company of 7 Englishmen. They live in 2 log huts. An elderly man named Martin is their captain. One of these miners on Canada Flat is named Barker. He comes from Norfolk and used to ply on the river between Cambridge and King's Lynn. The railway sent him, he says, to America, and he was very glad to talk about old England. I knew, of course, well some of the places he most fondly remembered, and he had not written for years, and no letters now came to him. Yet he has a daughter whom he has not seen since she was 2 years old. That was 14 years ago. I urged him to write. He said he would. He hopes to get back to the old country. So could this have been the Billy Barker who the town was named after? Seemed like it didn't fit Laborda's story of Billy Barker being a jumping ship and coming up to the Cariboo in the 1862. This, in fact, what happened then is I went to the record book for the Lillooet district in the archives, GR 0224, and looked at the records kept by Thomas Elwyn in the early years. And in 1859, he set up in Lillooet, or Cayush as it was called. And on September 29th, he began selling free miners licenses. Amazingly enough, the 9th one he sold was to a man by the name of William Barker. So now we've got Billy Barker back on the Cariboo River in 1859. So that's quite different from the story that had been propagated. And of course, historians since the time of Louis Laborda had taken the story and run with it and told exactly the same story as Laborda. But clearly there was something not quite right here. And so I went further into Bishop Hill's diaries. Friday, August the 1st, 1862. Now this is 2 years after he ran into the party that Barker was involved in. And he entitles this diary entry, Experienced Miner at Fault. Barker, the Cambridgeshire, now he's named Cambridgeshire, not Norfolk in this one, miner whom I met a year before last and roused about his neglected home, sought me out today. He has done well and thinks of returning to England for a while. He was one with about 100 others who prospected this creek last year. He himself was upon the richest claim, who pronounced it valueless and came away. So more information about Billy Barker. He arrived on Williams Creek among the very, very first, staked a claim above the canyon. And so clearly, this is the same Billy Barker. And of course, Bishop Hills goes on. He says on August 17th, which is just a couple of weeks after this other entry, he said, heard of the lead, which of course is this gold streak, being struck on the Barker claim, which I visited on William Creek several days ago. At once, each partner places his interest as worth $20,000. All for several days have been on the spree, that is more or less intoxicated and off work, except for one member of the company, a very worthy young Englishman and well brought up. So clearly, that's the Billy Barker who discovered gold below the canyon. And the story is very, very different from the one that historians had been telling for a very long time. And so what about this wife who ran out on him? Once again, I went to the archives and read microfilm of the British Colonist newspaper and came across this entry on May the 22nd, 1865. Died yesterday, Elizabeth Mary, wife of William Barker of Cariboo, age 38 years. The funeral will take place this afternoon at 2 o'clock from the residence, Yates Street. Friends are invited to attend. Well, Elizabeth Collier ran out on him all right. She died. So this poor woman had been maligned for over a century for being the one who ran out on Billy Barker. And they were clearly husband and wife living together when she died. And they obviously had a house in Victoria on Yates Street. And so the story was added to again and again. Dorothy Sweet, who was a genealogist who was studying Cornish miners, went to England and actually contacted the family, and turned out that Emma Eliza Driver was in fact the daughter of Billy Barker, and that he had been born in March, Cambridgeshire, and had been a waterman who worked on the barges in the fens of England. And so what a different story we ended up with. Was he born in Cornwall? No, he was born in Cambridgeshire. Had he been a pottery worker? Well, no, he'd been a waterman on the canals. Had he jumped ship? Well, no, he'd actually mined in California before coming to British Columbia. And in fact, he'd been in the mining vanguard on Williams Creek. Not only did his wife not run out on him, she died 2 years after marrying him. Now, Barker, of course, remained in the Cariboo and did manage to spend all his money. He gave lots of it away, was well loved among Caribooites because he would always stand them to a drink. But he was still mining in the 1890s. And when he died in 1894, he was a pauper, but was buried in Ross Bay Cemetery. So for me, to get that story right and to correct the obvious mistakes that had been made, just confirmed that I was doing the right thing. I thoroughly enjoyed setting the record straight for poor old Billy Barker. And I keep forgetting to put up. There he is. This photograph was taken years later. Would have been nice to find a photograph of him as a young man. But this is the Billy Barker after whom Barkerville was named. And it's safe to say that Barkerville became the #1 town in the colony of British Columbia and later on in the province of British Columbia for the incredible wealth that came out of it. Williams Creek was only mined for a few miles, and yet it produced $13 million worth of gold in 1860s standards. So today that works out to close to $1 billion. Bonanza Creek in the Yukon has produced more gold, but it was mined for about 20 miles. And so mile for mile, Williams Creek was probably the best gold creek in the world. And so I was happy to be at Barkerville. I became curator there in 1982, and we lived there happily. My first son was born in 1983, and we began to wonder. Every March or April, we would go to the Provincial Archives in Victoria and stay with our friends and see the blossoms all around us, and then go back to Barkerville, where we had at least 3 more months of snow. In fact, what was said is that in the Cariboo, there were 10 months of snow and 2 months of bad sledding. So obviously not a particularly wonderful place to live. And so I managed to land a job at the historic O'Keefe Ranch in 1984, became the manager curator. And we lived right at the O'Keefe Ranch, and it was a wonderful place to live. It was like having our own property. And we had another son arrive, and we lived at the O'Keefe Ranch. We raised the animals there. My wife looked after the flowers. But of course, for me, it was important to find something I could research. And so I began to look in the files and realize that the O'Keefe Ranch sat on the trail, the old cattle trail into British Columbia, and that story had not really been told. In fact, much of what had been told about the cattle coming into British Columbia was wrong. Among other things, the story said that these were Texas Longhorns that were being driven into British Columbia. I'm afraid they weren't. Oh, here's Bishop Hills. Sorry, Miss Bishop Hills, I should have put you in earlier, but anyway. These don't look like Texas Longhorns. In fact, what happened is cattle, British shorthorn cattle, had been driven over the Oregon Trail all through the 1840s and into the 1850s, and they had interbred with cattle from California, mostly Spanish blacks, and a wonderful breed of beef cattle had developed. It's called hybrid vigor. And so these cattle were driven up the trail through the Okanagan Valley, the old Brigade Trail, in great numbers all through the 1860s. In fact, between 1858 and 1868, 22,000 head of cattle were driven up this trail. And so I began to research this, and I began to find a fascinating thing about these early cattle drives. And that was, first of all, that the people who drove the cattle called themselves drovers. The term cowboy hadn't been invented yet. And when I began to look into these drovers, I began to realize that it was something very special. There were fully half of the people who drove cattle up into British Columbia were Indigenous men and women. So I looked at the account written by Jack Splon, who had been a cowboy who drove cattle up the trail. In his book, he relates it, Kamiakin, Last Hero of the Yakimas. And he writes about 1861 that the party who drove cattle was Joe Evans, Paul, a half-breed, Keneho, who's a Yakima First Nations, his wife Eliza, and cultist John. So 3 out of the 6 drovers who were driving cattle were First Nations. I became fascinated. Someone came through the O'Keefe Ranch and said his great-grandfather had come through the O'Keefe Ranch back in the 1860s and left a diary. And so I drove all the way to the Washington State Archives in Tacoma, Washington, and found Myron R. Brown's diary. He drove this diary for 1867 and 1868, chronicled 3 cattle drives up the trail. And Myron R. Brown wrote the same thing. He talks about the party that were driving cattle north, and he says, "This morning, we start again for BC with a drove of cattle. The company consists of 5 white men and 5 Indians, and withal a rather agreeable crowd, all things considered." What I began to find about the cowboys of British Columbia was that British Columbia was one of the few places in North America where the Indigenous people were welcomed as cowboys. And in fact, if you go to the cattle ranches of British Columbia today, including the Great Douglas Lake Cattle Ranch, you will find Indigenous cowboys. And so I was fascinated by that, and I began to realize that the cowboys in British Columbia were a special breed. Cattle had been driven all the way from California, and with them had come a man by the name of Newman Squires. Newman Squires had been trained by the vaqueros, who had come up from Mexico. Of course, California had been part of Mexico. And so Newman Squires had learned the vaquero way of life, and he brought it with him driving cattle north to British Columbia. Now in British Columbia, the drovers began to call themselves after the vaqueros, but of course they couldn't really pronounce the word right, so they called them buckaroos. And so west of the Rocky Mountains are the buckaroos. And the cowboys of British Columbia were pure buckaroo, whereas in Calgary across the Rockies, the cattle had come up from Texas and were nowhere near the same. And so I began to discover these incredible drives that came out of British Columbia. I read in 1874 that 107 head of horses were driven from Fort Kamloops through the Yellowhead by Adam Ferguson and James Christie and sold at Fort Edmonton for a great profit, because they were the very largest horses that had come into Alberta at any time. And so the cattlemen of BC began to realize that they could drive cattle through the Rockies, mostly the Crow's Nest Pass, and they could sell them at a profit. But even more interesting was that the first cattle to come into southern Alberta were driven by a man named John Shaw, 389 head of cattle, and there were 60 calves had been born on the cattle drive. They came through the North Kootenay Pass, and they arrived at Morley, which was down the Bow River, and were told that there was no market for cattle in southern Alberta. But so they wintered them there, and the next spring they heard banging going on down the Bow River, and this fort was being built. And they went to the fort, which was run by the Northwest Mounted Police, and the police said they would be glad to buy all the beef they could get their hands on. And so I'm happy to point out to my Alberta friends that the very first cattle to arrive in Calgary, the cattle capital of Canada, came from British Columbia. So fascinating. And so I began to spread the story. Now it's interesting that up until much later, I told these stories verbally. And so I gave talks to Rotary clubs, and I gave talks to the Canadian Club in Vernon and Kelowna, and every organization that was interested, I would go and tell the stories of the early cattle drive, kind of helped to beat the drum. So that's where my background was. I was an oral historian in many ways. I gave guided tours at the O'Keefe Ranch. I gave guided tours at Barkerville. And so what happened is I began to think maybe I should be writing this down. And so what I did is I applied for a grant called the Canada Millennium Grant. And it was money to pay me through O'Keefe Ranch winter, where there was no great salary coming in, if I could write a book. And so I put together a book that I named Buckaroos and Mud Pups. And of course, you know where the Buckaroos comes from. And that became my first book. But I wrote it in the year 2000, and then it sat on the shelf for years. Finally, in 2005, I thought, well, it's not going anywhere. So I sent it to Heritage House Publishing, and they published it. Now, some of you are going to ask, what does buckaroos, you know what buckaroos means, but what does mud pups mean? Here's cattle being driven through the Okanagan Valley, and you can see they were very fine beef cattle. And here are the Indigenous drovers. All of these First Nations. This is a group from the Similkameen, and they were the cowboys of British Columbia, and their story has seldom been told. And here's the book, Buckaroos and Mud Pups. Now people ask me, what the heck is a mud pup? And my answer inevitably is, buy the book and find out. So that's where I leave it. So what happened is that was a very successful book. It's still available. And in fact, it's in third printing. So there's about 10,000 of them out there. And so I thought, well, this is a lot of fun. And I actually make $1.40 a book. So I mean, in royalties, so I could retire forever on that amount. That's tongue in cheek, in case you wondered. So I wrote another book that picked up where this one, the Buckaroos and Mud Pups told the story up until the end of the First World War. And so I wrote another book that I named Bronkbusters and Hay Sloops, and that carried on the story of British Columbia ranching right up until the 1950s. And just to be sure, I wrote a third book, and it was called Frontier Cowboys in the Great Divide, and it talked about the interaction of cattlemen in British Columbia and Alberta, and how important British Columbia was in the early years of the cattle drive. And so that's the trilogy that I wrote on British Columbia ranching history. And the fascinating thing to me was that we used to have a cowboy festival at the O'Keefe Ranch where the ranchers and the cowboys of British Columbia would come and gather every year. And what I heard from the cowboys and the ranchers was, we really like your books. They tell it the way it was. To me, that was the greatest compliment, because of course they were really my audience. I wanted to tell their story, and I honestly feel that they appreciated what I was doing and considered me to be one of them. And they must have, because in 2015, I received the Joe Martin Memorial Award for Preservation of Cowboy Heritage in BC. And so I was honored for the work I did in British Columbia ranching history. And to me, that was the ultimate honor, because it was on honor of people who I valued their opinion very greatly. I also did a display online at the Virtual Museum of Canada called Buckaroos in BC in 2009. And I did a weekly column in the Vernon Morning Star. And that became, I put all those columns together and published that, and it was called Ranch Tales. And so that was book number 4. But I began to wonder whether maybe I could do something maybe a little more academic. And so on a trip back from visiting friends in Walla Walla, we came through the Grand Coulee, and there was a great big sign that talked about the Cariboo Trail. And I thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write a book. I'm going to see whether I can get this book published in Washington State, because that trail began at Walla Walla and the Dalles and went up through British Columbia. And if I could sell these books in Washington State and in British Columbia, maybe those royalties would amount to something. And so I began to do the research. Once again, went to the archives. But what I did is I pitched the book to Washington State University Press. And they said, yeah, we're very interested. And I wrote a manuscript for them. It went through 2 peer reviews and was recommended to the publication committee, and they turned it down. So I thought, well, maybe I'll try UBC. And I sent it to UBC, and yes, they were very interested, but no, their editorial committee turned it down. So I went to good old Heritage House, and they were happy to publish it. And I'm happy to say that Trail North won me second prize in the Lieutenant Governor's Award for British Columbia Historical Writing in 2018. So that was my flirtation with academia. Really, I found that I was a popular historian. I better stick with it. And so what happened is I began to look for another subject that I could research, and I began to find information. I began to look for information. I lived in near Vernon, and so I began to look for information on the BX Ranch. A friend of mine said, you know, the BX Ranch, what's the history of it? And so I went to the usual sources to see what I could find out about the BX Ranch. And I read this in F.W. Howey's British Columbia from the Earliest Times to the Present, Volume 2, where he says about the same time, 1864, Mr. F.J. Barnard and his associates in Barnard's Express obtained the BX Ranch, some 4 miles from Vernon, for the purpose of raising horses for their express business. In 1868, Mr. Stephen Tingley, the practical man of the company, went to New Mexico and brought up overland from about 400 head of horses from New Mexico to stock the ranch. From this source chiefly was drawn the supply of horses used in the Cariboo Road until 1897. Mr. Tingley, who had been in the meantime become the sole owner of the business, disposed of it to the British Columbia Express Company in 1897. Well, now this was interesting because it seemed like the BX Ranch was founded in 1864, but it puzzled me because the Barnard's Express stage line ran from Yale to Barkerville. Why would Francis Jones Barnard take up land some 200 miles from the wagon road and the stagecoach road that he had his stagecoaches running on? So I began to do some digging. And I also thought, well, okay, this interesting fact about Steve Tingley's cattle drive or horse drive from New Mexico was quite interesting. But what I began to learn after talking to my friend Linda Pederat was that Steve Tingley's diary was available in the BC archives. And so I went to the archives and tried to transcribe it, which is very hard to do with microfilm. But anyway, I learned that the true story was really quite different. First of all, he continued right past the Okanagan up into the Nicola country with these horses. He bought 300 head of horses, and he bought them in California in the Santa Barbara area, and drove them all the way to the Cariboo Road. So this 800-mile cattle drive was probably the longest one in the history of North America. And those horses became the horses that were used for the Cariboo Express. But what I did find is that Barnard had preempted land at the 134-mile post in 1867. And it was not until 1873 that he preempted the land that the BX Ranch became. British Columbia was already a Canadian province by then. And knowing Barnard, he would not have squatted on that land. And so the BX Ranch really isn't as old as the historians were saying. It really was preempted in 1873 and was not used to raise that many horses for the British Columbia Express or Barnard's Express. So what happened is I began to look further into Barnard's business in thinking that maybe this could be a book, because I know when I had been at Barkerville, we'd looked at Barnard's Express and thought, you know, it's too bad the records for the Barnard's Express don't exist. And so we will really never know the story of how it came to being. But of course, as I began digging in the archives, the British Columbia archives, I found wonderful sources in the archives. Now it's interesting because one of the stories that's told of Francis Jones Barnard, and I'm quoting from the Biographical Dictionary of Well-Known British Columbians in 1890, it says that Barnard carried letters and papers on his back and traveled on foot from Yale to Cariboo, a distance of 380 miles, or 760-mile round trip, 1,223 kilometers to be precise, which he entirely did on foot. And this kind of puzzled me as well, because to walk 380 miles on foot, it takes months. How can a person have an express business that is so slow? And so the interesting thing to me is every biography of Francis Jones Barnard written since then, since 1890, tells this same story about he carried the mail on his back. Well, he did, but as I began to dig into it, I realized that, first of all, he'd purchased Jaffrey's Express in 1861, which ran from Yale to Lytton. And he definitely had carried the mail on his back up the Fraser Canyon as far as Lytton. And in fact, his advertisement in 1862 said, Barnard's Express hitherto running between Victoria and Lytton, BC. And so the wonderful myth of Francis Jones Barnard carrying the mail on his back for this incredible journey is pure British Columbia mythology. The reality is he walked 86 kilometers or 53 miles and back. And so not exactly as prodigious as it sounds. And so I began to dig further in the British Columbia Express funds at the archives, and I began to find that there was an amazing connection that had not been chronicled before between Frank Barnard and the move for Confederation in British Columbia. As it turns out, Frank Barnard, who ran the British Columbia Express Company, had been a tremendous advocate for Canada. In fact, he'd come from Quebec City, where he was born, and he had been a member at the Yale Convention in 1867 that had wanted to have British Columbia join Confederation. In fact, he was one of the movers and shakers. What I began to realize is that Barnard was a talker, like me perhaps, and his contribution to the movement toward Confederation is not well recorded because he didn't write a lot of letters. You know, we look at the great newspapermen, John Robson and Amour de Cosmos, and they're credited with being major advocates. But Frank Barnard was probably every bit a father of Confederation as they were. And so I really think that, again, that story is one that has been corrected to be more accurate, and that Frank Barnard is finally getting his due. And so just to round things up, I would like to kind of interact a bit. Most of us are familiar with the BC Historical Federation, BC History. I'm going to move this along as well. There's Frank Barnard. I keep forgetting to do this. Okay, now Wendy Wickwire has written in the most recent publication, and actually this is the transcript of a talk she gave last fall, at least that's when I listened to it, and it's called Making History Public, Reflections of an Academic Historian. And I thought that what I would do is title my talk, Making History Public, Reflections of a Trade Historian. Because Wendy Wickwire makes the distinction between academic and what she calls trade. She calls them the two binaries, trade versus academic, amateur versus professional, popular versus serious, and that this divide exists between academic historians and what we would perhaps call popular historians. Well, I have to agree with her. There is a divide there. And I have to say that I have entered into researching BC history full bore, but I've come from a background of heritage sites, a museum background. And so for me, telling a story is important. And so my histories, all 6 of them, have had anecdotes in them. I've made a real effort to make them readable, accessible, I guess we would say. So I am not an academic historian. I found that out with my book, Trail North. But I do think that Wendy Wickwire reaches the point where she says that really all of us should be public historians because we need to be able to tell the story. And I think she's right. I think that rigorous research, there's no substitute for rigorous research. We need to spend our time in the archives. And there are times where I've spent entire days in the archives and come up with nothing. But there, I consider it to be time well spent because we need to do our research. And so yes, academic historians are there, but popular historians like myself are becoming more and more popular in British Columbia. Publishing houses, which like Heritage House that are called trade publishers, are doing a really good job of making history accessible. And I must say that during my time in British Columbia, I've seen a real movement in British Columbia history that it's not just a divide now between academic and public. It's the divide between marginalized people and old white guys is breaking down. The fact of the matter is there are new people at the table telling the stories. There are women, there are Indigenous people, there are Chinese. They're all telling the story of BC history, and they are to be welcomed for the work they're doing. It is so interesting to see that British Columbia history now has become more and more accessible and more meaningful to people who have been marginalized in the past. So there's a new version of Wagon Road North coming out that I've been editing. And in the process of editing, I've added chapters on the Indigenous people, on women of the Cariboo, and on the Chinese miners and merchants. And so I just want to conclude by saying that British Columbia history is changing before our very eyes, but there will never be substitute for good research on primary documentation. No longer can we be looking at stories that someone else has told and say, oh, I'll just use that information. We need to go back to primary sources. And so I will continue to hang out in the archives. I will continue to appreciate especially the staff at the archives, and I'll give a shout out to them. And I've sat in the archives for many, many days. And what I find is that they are so patient. It doesn't matter whether it's someone wanting to know their family history or whether it's an academic historian, they're all treated patiently and faithfully. So a shout out to the staff at the British Columbia Archives who continue to do a wonderful job. Thank you all for listening. And I'll now take questions.
Thank you, Ken. That was wonderful. Very insightful. It's always good to hear how much people are enjoying coming into archives. As an archivist, I love being in the archives.
Good for you. Yeah.
So I would invite anyone who has any questions for Ken to put them in the chat, and I will read them out for you, and we'll keep this discussion going. So I will start with someone in the chat, Ken.
Okay.
Marginalized voices are welcome, yes, and perhaps conventional academic voices are to be more sternly scolded for the lack of service they have delivered to this public. Have they discovered and revealed this history as you have?
Well, it's interesting because I am heartened by the work of Wendy Wickwire. I think that she's made a good point, and that point is that academic historians have to be more public. So they need to reach out, they need to somehow or another make their stories more readable. This is the ultimate irony to me. When I did my work for Washington State University Press and went through my peer reviews, the book I published, I had friends come up, so this is Trail North. I had friends come up and say, I didn't like that book as well as the other ones. It seemed a little hard to read. And so I thought, okay, maybe there's a lesson there. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Our next question, what's a mud pup?
Well, you have to buy the book. Okay, I'll let it out. You know, if you all promise to rush out and buy buckaroos and mud pups. It's my retirement fund after all. In the early days of British Columbia, the English would be fascinated by ranching, and especially the ranching way of life, because it actually was done on horseback. And only the rich English could ride horseback in the 1800s. And so what they would do is they would send their wayward second sons to British Columbia and other places as well, and pay the ranchers to teach them ranching. And the cowboys on the ranches had a name for these remittance men, but they called them mud pups, which sounds a little derogatory, but I must mention that some of those mud pups became wonderful ranchers and are still ranching. Their families are still ranching in British Columbia today. I think of the bailiffs in the Chilcotin. You know, Hugh Bailiff was a mud pup, and yet he took to British Columbia ranching. And so mud pups have their place in British Columbia ranching. Okay, the cat's out of the bag, I guess.
But anyone can still buy the book.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So we have another question. Barnard, in the Debates the House of Commons in 1880, the settlers of BC do not complain of justice being done to the Indian. What we complain of is that great injustice is being done to white settlers by awarding much larger tracts of land than the Indians can have any use for. Oh, actually, that's not really a question. As a follow-up, 0.3% of BC's land is Indian Reserve. Yes, that was not actually a question. Oops.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm depicting an era when those sort of comments were common. And of course, other great British Columbians, Amor de Cosmos, John Robson, were on that same hobby horse, that they believed the indigenous people were given too much land, and they were believed, again, of course, the Chinese should get nothing. And I'm happy to say that they were wrong. And obviously, there's a racism heritage that British Columbia has. I've shared over and over against the indigenous wives who married ranchers, and many of whom were eventually shuffled back to their people so that the ranchers could marry white women. There's a lot of harm that has been done to the indigenous people in the name of colonialism. So I won't pull any punches on that.
Our next question starts out as a thank you to Ken. And then it says, my dad operated Pioneer Transport in Kamloops in the 1930s. I'm sorry my brother is gone. He was a cowboy on the Parker Ranch with the Indigenous boys in Kamloops. Yep. Is that ranch covered in any of your books?
Only partially. Now, the interesting thing is I have been very popular among the ranching community, and they all want to be sure that their ranches are in my books. And I'm afraid to say not all of them are. I do talk about the Harper Ranch, which of course is close to Kamloops. But the indigenous ranchers were very well known in the area, that's for sure. And they probably, the Parker Ranch is only tangentially covered in my books.
Okay. We will leave it open for any other questions that may appear.
Okay.
We have one here. This person is wondering if your research ever uncovered any information about the environmental impacts of cattle drives and imports in BC.
Yes, to a great extent. And of course, I actually, if you want to go on the BC Provincial Museum Living Landscapes website, I've done a whole study on there for the BC Museum on bunchgrass. And bunchgrass grew in abundance all along the trail through British Columbia, and was one of the reasons why this trail was so successful, is because the drovers were able to let their cattle graze on the bunchgrass along the way. The bad news is the bunchgrass is very susceptible to overgrazing, and now only exists in certain ranges in British Columbia where conservation efforts have been made, because it's almost impossible to bring bunchgrass back when it's been overgrazed. And so the environmental impact of ranching on the bunchgrasses has been significant. But I should mention the valley bottoms, especially the Okanagan. It wasn't the overgrazing that killed the bunchgrass, it was orchards and then housing developments, which are still busily gobbling up land in the Okanagan.
All right. We have two questions here quite similar, so I think I'll combine them. What do you plan on working on next? What book do you see in your future?
Well, good question. I actually have been playing around since 2013 with a novel set in the British Columbia Gold Rush. And, you know, as my connection with O'Keefe Ranch, I do murder mysteries there, among other things. Cowboy dinner shows, so cowboy poetry is part of it. But I'm thinking I'm going to do a murder mystery set in British Columbia, Gold Rush, British Columbia. And if you do your research, you will find that just a couple of miles downriver from Hope was a gravel bar mined in the 1858 era called Murderer's Bar. So stay tuned for the new novel. Someone has asked me to do a book, a history book on sheep in British Columbia as well. And so it never stops. I need opportunities to get to the British Columbia archives again.
That'll happen. We'll be on the lookout for the next one. And how about, did you ever touch on the Wild Horse Gold Strike in the Kootenays? Yes,
it's interesting that that was, of course, at the end of the Dewdney Trail. And the Dewdney Trail originally went through where Osoyoos is now, and through Rock Creek, where there was a gold rush that was getting cattle, and then went all the way to the Wild Horse Creek Gold Rush in the Kootenays, East Kootenays, in fact. And I touched upon it, especially like J.C. Haynes, who was the customs collector, magistrate, gold commissioner at Osoyoos, ended up getting stationed in Wild Horse Creek for a number of years, which is a pity because he was the most prodigious collector of information on numbers of cattle and that sort of thing. So while he was away, we have a blank. So a bit of the Wild Horse Creek Gold Rush, but cattle were being driven up through Washington State to the Kootenays. Okay, I should make a note. I think I said the Yale Convention, it was in 1868. I don't know when I said, I think 67. So I'm out by a year. Somebody sent me that text, so.
Yes. Unless we have any final questions, which we'll give it a second for that, but I would like to thank everyone for attending on behalf of the Friends of the BC Archives, and remind you all that our next presentation is on April 18th, and it's Boom and Bust with Jennifer Butler. So thank you all so much for attending, and we hope to see you next month.